Atheist stories have happy endings. Hey guys, welcome to my 200 sub bonus video! Woo! Cheesy effect! I don't know if I like this one. I think I'm gonna try another one. 200 sub bonus video! Woo! Cheesy effect! I think that one's a little bit better. Anyway, welcome to my 200 subscriber bonus video, and this is just a way for me to say thank you guys for your subscriptions and your support. It really does mean a lot to me, and to show how much it means, I'm making an extra video to say thank you for pressing that little red subscribe button that pops up underneath my content. Those of you who watch my channel know that I am doing deconversion research, and I promised at the end of a different Atheist Reads video, the 10th episode, that to celebrate 200 subscribers, I would be telling my deconversion story. And I'm going to do that. But it is also the case that because I've been doing so much research, I can't just tell a story now without seeing the larger picture. And so in this video, I'm going to present you with the story within a story. So I'm going to present some of the elements of the deconversion process that I've been observing, and I will use my personal story as a way to do a case study and explain how these phases and these moments of time come together. I'm all cozy. I am ready to go. I've got my coffee here, and I've got my notes, and so this might be a little bit longer, on the longer side of the video, but I'm hoping it'll be more conversational, but still educational. So in terms of what I'm going to be presenting in my deconversion story, I want to go over the things that I want to discuss, because if you see again the roadmap and where we're going, it'll be easier for you to follow along. The things that I'm going to talk about are first of the kind of categories that people fall into, and I see two types of people who become eventual atheists. Then I'm going to discuss the phases of deconversion. These include processes like naive faith, having doubts, paradigm shifts, where the believer starts to perceive something about their belief system in a different way. There's also an element in an atheist deconversion process which I'm referring to as the intellectual renaissance, and that's the moment that the person who's questioning decides to go out and just start doing research. And that's the beginning of their intellectual renaissance. I'm also going to discuss paradigm shifts again, sort of these happen in phases and add up. Then I'm going to discuss retrenchment as a concept, and that means when a person starts to have real serious doubts and begins to drift away from the notion of their religion. Generally, they don't go immediately into atheism. They do what I call retrenchment, and that is either visiting different denominations or moving to a more liberal religious belief system. So I'll discuss my own retrenchment, and then ultimately, when the paradigm shifts become too great in terms of the supernatural itself, there can be what I call world collapse, and it's a term I want to investigate a bit more and define more completely, but it's that moment where the person really can't turn back. They cross a line in terms of what counts as evidence and what counts as truth, and that means that they can no longer really comfortably go back to a world of faith. And how also there's a drive that's quite common in deconversion stories. The reason why people are driven to this world collapse, even if it's painful and emotionally stressful, is because they're committed to the truth. And I find in a lot of deconversion stories, including my own, that the notion of knowing what the truth is, regardless of whether it's beautiful or ugly, just knowing that it's the truth in and of itself provides a satisfaction that cannot be replaced with faith. So that's the general sort of conceptual ideas I'll be drawing on, and I also hope that you'll notice that there are intellectual, moral, and emotional elements of a person's deconversion process. My deconversion story. It is pretty ordinary. When I look back on it now, it's very typical and does not stand out in any real significant way from the overall arc of deconversion. People from the start seem to have a mental predisposition. Just a second. We know from neurology that there are people who have brain structures that are more suitable for spiritual experience, and other people's whose brain structures are not conducive to experiencing what people would call the numinous in Karen Armstrong's History of God language. And I find that in terms of people's stories, in that if you are born what I call a natural skeptic, these are people who, I think of Christopher Hitchens and others who, as they describe growing up, they have very early on a sense of certainty about making decisions as to what's valid and not valid. They're quite confident in their ability to make an assessment of a claim and make their own determination, or feel that something has to make sense to them in order for them to accept it. And I'm going to post a video from 43 Alley, who gives a very brief deconversion story, but it is one that tends to focus on the things that a natural skeptic would focus on. So if you want to see the difference between a natural skeptic and a natural believer, I would pick 43 Alley's story. He might not be, but the way he presents it is very much within that natural skeptic framework. And I'm going to compare that with my story, which is more of a natural believer, and also the Evidence series. If you've watched his deconversion, he was very much a sincere believer. So my deconversion story is closer to that Evidence arc than a natural skeptic, because I certainly was a very, I call it naive faith growing up. So in terms of my timeline, I would say from about birth to the age of 10, I was raised as a Catholic and didn't question much of that. And then by the time I turned 10, and I'll tell a little bit more about why, then I started to have more questions, and those questions built up until about the ages of 16, 17, at which point I, for the sake of my mom and her asking on behalf of my grandparents, I went through confirmation in the Catholic Church. And then that was like the last thing I wanted to do with the Catholic Church. I had no interest in religion, but I was still not an atheist. And so from about the ages then of 17 to like my late 20s, 27, 28, I would guess I'd probably just say I was agnostic. And then after that point, I felt that there was something missing in my life that I needed to address. And that was when I went into what I would call my retrenchment phase, when I went into Buddhism and became very interested and very committed as a practitioner. That lasted until I was about 33, and I left to go to study a master's degree and fell out of the practice of my Sangha and entered a new world where I was learning about the philosophy of social science and Popper and all these kinds of ideas. And eventually my Buddhism practice fell off, my supernatural beliefs fell away, and I very quietly and sort of almost without realizing it ended up becoming an atheist. But there were really traumatic moments. It happened earlier. The atheism was sort of kind of, didn't really go out with a bang, but the first parts of it were quite intense. And I'll talk a little bit more about those right now. In my childhood, and I think in a lot of people's deconversion stories that I see, one of the problems that Christianity has is that it sets itself up for failure, in my opinion, because it takes kids when they are at a very young age and tells them things about God that they are willing to accept without criticism because they don't have critical faculties. And so in the way that kids believe that somehow Santa can have a list and know if they're naughty and nice and get around the globe all in one night, they hold all of these what seem obvious logical contradictions without trouble, because they don't have the kind of cognitive dissonance yet in terms of forcing things to agree. And I see in a lot of people's stories about when they're raised as children, they're taught that God is loving and good and forgiving, and there's all these positive sides of it. But then, because I'm listening to Christian stories, that is then coupled with he is absolutely terrifying and you will burn in hell if you disobey him. So it's this really confusing set of emotional cues. One that says, I love you, I accept you, and the other one that says, you're not good enough, I don't accept you, I'm going to punish you if you don't do what I want. And these claims of the omni claims and the evidence for the cruelty of God that's found in the Bible really set people up for failure, because you simply cannot continue to live in a world, without cognitive dissonance to some of the biblical claims. And I say that as if it's a universal, but I think it is quite fair to say that people like William Lane Craig and other people who hold presuppositionalism, adults are still able to hold elements of complete cognitive dissonance without trouble, like they were as a child. They just, I think, don't tend to think about it, or they assume the truth of it so that there is no cognitive dissonance. But for most people who aren't willing to blind themselves to evidence and factual statements, these claims of religion in childhood simply do not withstand the scrutiny of adult investigation. So in my view, religion really does sow the seeds of its own destruction by making God to everything. He's bound to fail the way that they present him to children. In terms of my own upbringing, I was surrounded by Catholics. I grew up in a very, very small town. I grew up in a town of, I think, about 2,000 people. The largest city was about 20-30 minutes away by car, and that was 24,000 people. So I grew up in a very rural place, and all of my neighbors were Catholics, and all of my family were Catholics, so I didn't actually know there was other religious faiths besides Catholicism for a really long time in my life. And although we were raised in the faith, and I went to CCD, which is Sunday school for those of you who aren't Catholic, it wasn't a huge issue in our family. So we didn't pray before meals, except at holidays, when we had family gatherings and those kinds of things. But in a day-to-day way, religion didn't so much intrude in my life, other than God existed and there was hell, and I was afraid of it. I definitely was afraid of hell growing up as a child. I would say the first breaks in my faith came when my parents got divorced. And that was because my mother stopped taking communion, because when you're divorced in the Catholic Church, you are not meant to take communion, and that, to me, put her immortal soul in danger. And it really, really scared me. It very much traumatized me to think that my mother was at risk for going to hell because she was getting out of a marriage that was, to be honest, not a good marriage. My parents getting divorced was probably one of the better things that happened in my life, because they were not happy together, and they both managed to go out and find people that they were happy with. And that made my life a lot better. So it really didn't make any sense to me, from a moral perspective, why the church would be taking up what seemed to me to be a very immoral perspective. My mother eventually got an annulment and got remarried in the Catholic Church, so the whole not taking communion thing sorted itself out eventually after some money and more money to the Catholic Church. But by that point, there was a crack, and this first crack is quite common in people's deconversion stories. People who were believers, when they have a first doubt, they don't run away and become atheists right away. That just isn't the case. People tend to sublimate. They will ignore a problem. They will push it underneath, and it doesn't go away, it just gets pushed to the side. And with me, the kinds of issues that I had to sublimate kept growing. So at first it was the divorce thing. There was also a lot of issues about just like, morality in terms of slavery being in the Bible. The status of women in particular bothered me. I was in favor of contraception and the idea of women having control of their own fertility, and I stood in opposition with the Catholic Church to that. I grew up being quite open to homosexuality and gay people's rights. That was another area I found myself disagreeing with the Catholic Church. And as I grew older, all of my political positions took me away from the Catholic Church, and I became more and more of a Democrat. And so by the time I got to be 17, I was really, really fed up with Catholicism and wanted nothing to do with it. So as I said, I went through confirmation because my mom asked me to. And my mom asked me to because if I didn't, then she would get crap from my grandparents. So you can see how this structure of, it wasn't like it was important to her that I do it because she was worried about my soul. She was worried about my grandparents' perception, and she was quite willing to let me make decisions, and have my own opinion. But that kind of knock-on pressure is why I was closeted as an atheist for a very long time, because I knew it would have disturbed people to just know that there was an atheist in their midst, because, the uniform practice of Catholicism in my family. And I just wanted to kind of flag that up as an example of how people who are on a path to deconversion, or even people who are already atheists, often stay closeted because of social pressure, or because they don't want to disappoint their family members, they don't want to hurt them, and they end up denying who they are in order to protect the people they love. But that's much later on in the deconversion process. Let's get back to my story and this first break and what happened after that. As I said, I had a period from about the age of 17 to my late 20s where I was pretty much just agnostic and didn't think very much about religion. I'd gone to university, I was busy, sort of meeting people, getting a job, and when I got out of university, settling down. But by the time I got to my late 20s, I had my job sorted, I had a house and a dog and a relationship, and it felt like there was space for these questions to come up. And this, again, is another part of a very common part of people's deconversion stories. Deconversion doesn't happen, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a very small period of time. Some people do, especially if they're younger, they're teenagers, they might talk about becoming an atheist over the course of, 3 years or something like that. But for people who start this process much later on or don't get around to asking these questions until later in life, the process of eventually becoming an atheist can take, as in my case, up to decades. I said before that people who have questions about their faith don't immediately tend to walk into atheism. If you had a belief and were raised in a belief, it is far more common for people to go into a different denomination or to try a different religion. And that's because, in general, when questioning theists go out, start to have these questions, there's a multi-phase process here, right? Because it's not just, atheism isn't just about theism. People tend to react to religion first. They react to things they don't like in the Bible for Christians. And so instead of rejecting the notion of God, they first reject the structures or the book or the denomination or religions in general and become spiritual but not religious. In other words, you don't have a question about Catholicism and then become an atheism. You have to undermine Catholicism, or if you're a Baptist or a Protestant of a different, Methodist, Protestant, or anything else. You have to, a lot of people do the structures first. Some people don't. Some people undermine God first and just walk away. But generally it tends to be more people will have a problem with their religious faith first, and then they'll have a problem with God and the supernatural, and then they finally realize they've become atheists. And in my case, I started my quest for the spiritual first by going back to monotheism. And that's when I read Jack Miles' A God, a biography, and Karen Armstrong, and that's when I started to pick up people like John Dominican Crossan and other people. Those authors really gave me, it was after reading Jack Miles and Karen Armstrong that I decided I couldn't be a monotheist intellectually. And that was a huge break for me, because I had still a childhood fear of hell. Hell and the idea of eternal torment and being tortured for hell was not a rational mental place. It was obviously a fear that is like the boogeyman in the closet. It was a fear that was attached to my childhood self, because it was in those childhood moments of terror that's when I was taught hell and associated that kind of fear with hell. So the process of actually rationally deprogramming the panic attack I would start to feel if I started to contemplate letting go of the monotheistic God. It was that terror, those panic attacks, that I had to use my own resources to beat back. And another thing that really drives me to do this deconversion research is that this is a really difficult process. If you go from being a believer into being an atheist, you're destroying your whole world and everything you've ever known. And that means facing a lot of fears, and it means drawing on things that you didn't, about yourself, that you didn't know you had, because religion doesn't allow you to develop them. So it's a difficult process, it's a painful process, and more often than not, it's a private process, because atheists don't have necessarily, in a lot of these stories, they don't have people to turn to because they're in faith communities. So when they bring up doubts to their parents or their pastors, they're told they need to pray harder, that they need to have more faith, that the fault isn't with the contradictions in the Bible, it's with their hearts and their doubts. And again, this emotional burden is put back on the believer, and that emotional burden is something they have to overcome in order to escape the religious mindset. And for me, the most important paradigm shift in my whole deconversion process was getting over the fear of hell. Because once I abandoned that fear of hell, then I could walk away from the concept of God. That was already intellectually and emotionally and morally unsatisfying. But it was the irrational hell fear that kept me tied, just in case. What if I was wrong? And eventually I was able to overcome it. And it's been so long now, I don't remember what it's like to fear hell, except when I listen to the stories of theists who are struggling. Then I recall how difficult it was. So for those of you who are natural skeptics or who have never been brought up in faith, I would hope that the one thing you can maybe take away from this story and the research in general is the bravery of people, these pioneers who have doubts and are in a faith community that doesn't give much credence to doubt. It doesn't give much value to curiosity. And yet they, despite all of those pressures, continue to search for the truth and end up on a path that leads them to atheism. They're very brave people, and a lot of them have faced really difficult emotional problems, challenges, fears and pain that they have had to overcome with no one to help them, with no one to talk about it with, or maybe just be online and talk to strangers about it. But it's worth, I think, exploring and also for praising these people for doing what they've done. So like a lot of other atheists, moving away from the surroundings of your religious routine has a big impact. A lot of people talk about going into the military, going to university, or moving away from home, and then having to kind of recreate or reestablish a new version of their religious practices. But that also gives them an opening to think for themselves. For me, I had started this exploration by myself, away from my family, and I never turned to my family for any of these kinds of questions. I didn't even really talk to my partner at the time about this. It was a very, very private conversion, a very, very private process I was going through. But I did go on to a website called Beliefnet, which I still hang out on from time to time. And at the time there was like a Bible debate thread, now it's Christianity debate, and they have atheism debate. And I had, did my Buddhism phase there. I sort of started out agnostic and became a Buddhist, and was a Buddhist for a few years online, and then decided, as I said, drifted away from it. But that was important because I learned through debate a lot of things that I had never learned before. And this questioning phase in my late 20s began what I call my intellectual renaissance. This is very, very common in deconversion stories. You have people who are brought up in faith, and they're told what the world is like. They have these doubts, and they go out looking for information. Now, this can take a lot of different paths. I've heard people talk about being raised as creationist, and when they go out to look for evidence of creationism, then they confront evidence for the theory of evolution for the first time, and they realize they've been lied to, and this opens up an explosion of their interest in understanding the natural world. Another person I could think of, his way of dealing with his doubts was to go into apologetics and to try to undermine his own doubts about his Christianity by going to apologetics and learning the arguments to get more confidence. Unfortunately, the process of learning about these apologetics undermined the credibility, and he continued on his path to atheism. For me, I became really fascinated with the Bible, and this is another common element you often find, and you guys will know this from experience. Atheists read the Bible, Christians believe the Bible, and that's really the difference between the two groups. We've read it, they cherry pick it, and my renaissance, as it were, maybe because I was interested in history and I liked things at, historical at university, I became fascinated by the Bible as a text. And I've often felt guilty about this. As an atheist, people have said, well, you are an atheist, why do you care so much about the Bible? You must be, you must believe in God to be fascinated by it. And I didn't have a good answer until I started watching a lot of other people's deconversion stories. I'm not the only one. Other atheists, it's not universal, but some atheists, generally atheists, will read the Bible because they'll want to actually know what it says. So we have a lot of experience with the text. But some of us become more interested in its text, just like some people become more interested in the theory of evolution or arguments against apologetics. For me, it was the Bible as a text. And so I had a whole explosion of studying biblical history and textual criticism, and learning about the Q gospel, learning about various other lost gospels, reading Mack and Maccabee and Bart Ehrman and all kinds of other authors. And it wasn't so much that I was interested in the Bible is for its information. I mean, it's not, Buddhism is far superior in terms of an ethical system because it's humanism. I mean, you can strip away the supernatural elements of Buddhism, and there's a lot that's still worth, listening to, and I certainly have a lot of time for it. But that interest in the Bible helped to demystify it and help me understand it better in a way that I found very satisfying. So again, an intellectual renaissance is very much characteristic of a person's deconversion story. And how that takes, what shape that takes will depend on their interest and their experience. And for me, when I first started out, it was definitely the Bible, but then eventually it became a bit more into apologetics, and then I've kept up with it. And in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, I've done a lot of self-teaching on the theory of evolution and scientific issues, cosmology. So as I said in another video, atheists tend to be highly autodidactic, and this process of having questions and going out and looking for answers that are satisfying just brings forth an entire new way of looking at the world, which of course then sets them up when they're atheists. This gives them a place to land. But they don't realize it at the time, because questioning theists don't set out to become atheists. They go out looking for evidence of God, and they just don't find it and end up realizing that they're atheists. That's how the process goes every time that I've heard a story. I've never yet come across someone who said, I believed in Jesus, but I wanted to become an atheist, so I went out and I became an atheist. If you find that person, please let me know. Send them to me, because they would be a wonderful counterfactual. But most people, actually all the people, as I said, they go looking for evidence. They go out looking for evidence of God. And it's the fact that they don't find it that leads them to atheism. Being on the internet was really important to my deconversion, because it put me into interactions with people with a lot of different faith perspectives, and that required me to react and also to look up evidence, to substantiate my claims, to check my facts, to learn more. And all of that pushed me increasingly to understand the Bible better and to understand evidence better. And I learned a lot through the process of debate. So the internet, for me as for other people who become atheists, becomes really vital as a source of stimulation that you don't get from your community, especially from your faith community. As I said, I didn't go from Catholicism into agnosticism into atheism. I went from Catholicism into agnosticism into Buddhism into atheism. And that retrenchment is quite common, where people go into either more liberal Christian denominations, and again my focus is generally on Christians, or they go into paganism or Buddhism, or more liberal. Basically they move in a direction of increasingly liberal religious perspectives. For me, the big part of my deconversion was certainly the hell factor, but the reason I was attracted to Buddhism was because of the saying, O monks and wise men, just as a goldsmith would test his gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, so must you examine my words and accept them, not merely out of reverence for me. And I was attracted to the idea of a spiritual leader who would say, don't believe me just because they give me a special title. Here are my teachings. Go and try them out. When you've had experience of them and you know they work for you, then have faith in them. That blew my mind, really blew my mind. And so there were, even though I wanted to have faith, I wanted there to be a supernatural karma and the God, the ideas of the God realms and the hell realms and the various beings. It wasn't as important to me in terms of my practice as hell was in Catholicism. Buddhism for me was very much more about solving my daily problems, about the fact that I had a lot of anger when I drove especially, and becoming more calm, learning how to practice patience, learning how to practice rejoicing in the happiness of others, not jealousy, learning how to practice renunciation and being comfortable in renunciation as opposed to grasping at things all the time. So I was really focused on the more practical problem-solving elements of it, although I had faith. But there came a moment, and I think this happens quite often with atheists in very private moments. Theists who convert have moments of public acceptance, and it's a very emotional, very public celebration. Atheists who are formerly theists have this in moments of quiet reflection. Sometimes they're not even thinking about God. it's just something comes together. One person's story talked about being at university, and the university lecturer asked, have any of you ever experienced a paradigm shift? And he realized at that moment that he no longer believed in God because of the process he'd been going through. Another person describes, what they can remember that day is they were walking to get a magazine off the shelf, not even remember what they were thinking about, and suddenly they go, I'm an atheist. Like, wherever that thought process led them, they don't really remember. It was just the I'm an atheist realization. It was kind of the same thing for me too. I was driving along in the car, doing my Buddhist chants, which I did a lot when I was driving because it was like a good use of my free time. And I just thought, what if it's all in my head? What if this is all made up? And I think it's difficult if you've never believed to understand what it's like when you start to peek behind the curtain. Because this is where I think atheists get angry. You feel lied to. You feel betrayed. You feel like an idiot. Or at least I do. I should say I felt humiliated. I felt betrayed. I felt like an idiot. Because how could I have not seen? Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And that was the point, the final paradigm shift, which led to what I call a world collapse. I could no longer see the world as having a supernatural element. So it wasn't just that I rejected Catholicism. It wasn't just that I rejected God. I had to go all the way down to really question the existence of the supernatural in any meaningful way. And that moment of, what if it's all in my head? At that point, I wasn't even an atheist. I just felt like everything, there was nothing beyond my own senses that I could trust anymore. And when I went away, I went to get my master's at the age of 30-something, 31, 32, 33. It is like 10 years ago. I know vaguely when it happened. 2003, so yeah, 31, I think, 31, 32. When I got out of the Sangha, my Buddhist community, and went to university, and I was learning about the philosophy of social science and falsification, and doing statistics to study behavioralism, that final drift into just grounding everything in an empirical basis, and having a value of being correct and accurate, and understanding that you can talk about stuff with a margin of error, and you don't have to be perfect as long as you understand that you've got a little bit of margin of error, but our best guess is this. And I just drifted, I think, away from all of the supernatural parts. I still have a lot of time for Buddhism. I have a lot of sympathy. I have a lot of affection for Buddhism. And that's because even when I left, I became an atheist. When I have times of doubt, when I have times of crisis, when I have anger, or when I have other issues that I need to deal with, it's Buddhism that I turn to, still, to this day. I'll just not pay attention to the karma stuff, and I won't pay attention to any of that. But when it comes to the real practical human emotions, compassion, empathy, kindness, patience, all these things, it's the best way that I've found to guide me in my life. It's a very good set of principles, and that's why I still have a lot of time for Buddhism. So it helped me deal with my fear of death and my fear of loss and getting through death and loss. So it's been very valuable to me. So that's about it. In terms of my process, as I said, I'm not really that outstanding. I'm not particularly unique. My process took, 2 decades, I guess. Well, from the time I was, let's say, 17 until I was in my late 30s. Yeah, 20 years. And it's only in the last probably 6 months that I realized I was a closeted atheist. I've been living in Europe, and living in Europe as an atheist is really easy. I see my family for holidays, but we don't tend to talk about these kinds of things. I'm not there to be asked about whether or not I'd gone to church on Sunday. These kinds of questions just don't come up in my daily life. And I did start to feel uncomfortable about the fact that I didn't think I was a closeted atheist. I just thought I was an atheist until I realized how much I just didn't talk about it, and how I deliberately refrained from taking on that title, and how I deliberately protected people who I loved by not using that word. And that's changing. That's changed in the last couple months, because it is important to normalize atheism, and I don't have to hide anything, and I shouldn't have to hide my feelings in order to protect the world. I think the world is big enough and strong enough to accept my atheism. And that's why I wanted to tell my story, because, and the last thing, and this is so important, and maybe I should like put this as a preview, but atheist stories have happy endings. People who deconvert from a religion invariably end up saying they are happier as an atheist, they are more satisfied in terms of their life and being settled in their own values. They know who they are, they know what they believe, they live for this life. They're not worried about living for another life. They want to enjoy and make the most of what they have here and now. And that's a really happy ending, because if you live day to day appreciating it and knowing it for what it is, and to be astounded by the fact that we are made of star stuff and that we have this brief moment in time, that to me is a joyous ending. And it's not the you believe in nothing. No, we believe in human flourishing, and we believe in goodness and in the potential of the human species. We believe in a lot of positive things that we're so focused a lot of times on the intellectual arguments. We're starting now, I think, as an atheist movement to make more of the personal arguments. And another reason I want to just talk about this very quickly is I'm seeing, in terms of the atheist movement itself, we've had what I call, informed by feminism, first wave atheism, which was the European guys getting up and, or American European guys getting up and making arguments and making statements and declaring what atheism is and sort of defining the terms and making really good points. And all of those contributions were incredibly valuable for presenting atheism as something that exists and has to be engaged with, and that it has valid points. I think now what I'm seeing within the atheist community is still that first wave atheism, but more of what I'm calling a second wave atheism. And this is people who are less interested in debate and more interested in discussion. They are interested in making connections with people who aren't strident atheists, and they want to talk to people who are theists but sympathetic to secular values in public spaces, so we can all feel safe and accepted. And it's less about winning debates and more about creating connections. And I think that this is a very natural process, and I see it a lot. I see it with atheist analysis, I see it with the foxhole atheist, I see it with the friendly atheist, the thinking atheist. I see a lot of this attempt to create more discourse rather than debate. And that's, I think, an element of this is to understand the emotional side of deconversion, the emotional values of atheists, and presenting these in a positive way, showing that atheists are happy people. We are just people who go one God further. And the deconversion research I want to do, or I am doing, the intention is to contribute to normalizing atheism and to making it okay for someone to say, yeah, I think I'm an atheist. And it's less important to me that people want to take on the label of atheism so much as they feel safe saying that, and that they don't worry about offending people or getting a reaction or putting other people on guard. And I know from my own experience, just talking to friends, it has been interesting when I bring up what I'm doing about my deconversion research. If I bring up other kind of social research I'm doing about qualitative investigations into leadership perceptions, people will ask me about the topic, and they'll be more interested in, the kinds of leaders I'm looking at or other things like that. When I bring up the fact that I'm looking into how people go from faith into atheism, it's interesting the number of people who start to talk about their doubts. And they'll say, I'm not an atheist, and I'm not interested in becoming an atheist, but I have these kinds of questions and these things concern me. And it was fascinating. Like it was really fascinating, because when even bringing it up to my friends who they know me and they trust me, I felt opening up that conversation, I was no longer doing research on a topic. I was having a really sensitive conversation with somebody about a topic that they otherwise might not have felt interested in bringing up. And that to me says something, that there are spaces, safe spaces, where people do have doubts and they don't have anyone to talk to. And if we as atheists and as secularists, or whatever label we want to give ourselves, learn more about that deconversion process, realize that our conversation today might not end up with the person becoming an atheist, but they might be on that path already. And this conversation is going to be one more step on that path for them. And that's another reason why I want to do this deconversion research, to help people understand the process of doubt and realize that any theist who comes back and wants to talk to atheists again and again and again might be a questioning theist. They might be having doubts, and their bravado and their bluster might be an attempt for them to get confidence in teachings that they're losing confidence in. So the more we learn about this process, I think the more open dialogue we can have, the more safe spaces we can create, and the better we can do to be a resource for those people who are having private moments of crisis, to let them know they aren't alone, that that doubt is not dangerous, that blind faith is not satisfying, and that for those people who would rather have an ugly truth than a beautiful lie, there are people like them out there. We are perfectly happy with an ugly truth if it's leading to more questions and it's challenging us and making us think about the world in a different way. The world doesn't have to be beautiful according to our aesthetic. It's more important that we are right as much as possible about the world around us. And that's what atheists do. We have a value of truth. And at the end of the day, we are not willing to compromise our truth or our value of truth. Yeah, and I'm very proud of that about us, about our community. And I think we should talk about it a bit more, not in a way of arrogance, but in a way of about a value. I have to have evidence, and this is what speaks to me. This has gone on for quite a long time, and I hope you found the information interesting. If your story doesn't map onto mine perfectly, I am not surprised. However, what I would expect is for you to go, yeah, I recognize that, or I went through something similar. My particular deconversion was, I am European American, I'm a woman, I grew up in the Midwest. A lot of my experience is also because of my class location, my ethnicity, my sex, and I'm definitely trying to be very sensitized in my deconversion research to how these demographics have an impact on the way that people go from theism into atheism. That will come out more in the coming weeks. But until then, thank you, my 200 subscribers. Thank you, all you geeks and nerds who stuck around to the end of the video because you wanted to know how it all turned out and what the world collapse, how it all panned out. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back on my channel Thursdays for a different atheist reads. Twice a month I put out videos under my series An Atheist Asks, and the one coming up is going to be on scientific prediction versus biblical prophecies. So I hope to see you right around, I guess probably about in a week's time for that video. And thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for subscribing. I'll see you guys later on. Have a great day.